Welcome to sNAPAshots, conversations with professional, practicing, and applied anthropologists.
So my name is Feras Klenk. Right now, I'm a senior UX researcher at Edward Jones. I mean, it's sort of like standard narrative, I think, with everyone who got interested in anthropology, growing up in a multicultural household. My father's Lebanese, my mother's Mexican. So, kind of growing up with like those two cultures side by side, like what's my identity, waxing, waning, over the decades, but also growing up in the United States and sort of like consuming, bits of Americana kind of mediated, through those. I guess at the time, I would see as like binary identities. And now that I'm, I think 40 years old, I can, approach these bits in a way that makes sense to me. They're more fluid and I don't really have to think about what other people think of like who I am, right? Because that's sort of like the curse of the diaspora kid, like who I think whoever is like binational, like knows what I'm talking about. Right, and being told, well, you're not really this, you're not really that, your language abilities are not that great, or you're not authentic enough. So a lot more relaxed about these sorts of things. So I guess that would be the initial impulse to take up, anthropology, to kind of study that. I mean, basically study it myself. I mean, I think that's for a lot of people who end up pursuing a PhD. It's kind of like therapy, basically. Funny story, I think one of the jobs that I got with FedEx, when I was interviewing with them, I just kind of mentioned offhand, anthropology. And that sort of got my foot in the door. They're like, oh, we had an anthropologist, come on in. And we liked that person. They were cool. I'm like, what did they do? Like, we can't tell you anything, but we just like this person. No, but seriously, right? In terms of practice, I think it's more like the way I see it in terms of my own work. It's more like an orientation, right? What I bring to the table in terms of thinking about at Edward Jones, such as bringing the background to the fore, right? Because obviously I'm working with financial advisors, but obviously the work of their branch office assistants and other client support staff to some degree goes unnoticed, and bringing that to the fore, to the product owners and whatnot, in terms of access to tools, things of that nature, as an example, right? Thinking holistically, right? Not just in this tiny little narrow box, as it may be. There's still a tiny narrow box because we're all siloed in different product teams. But to the extent that is possible, try to think in terms of in systems, as I would use, socio-technical studies term, right? Because obviously we bring in different judgment, right? We bring in that sort of curiosity. People will be like, wow, you find this stuff interesting? This is boring. This is boring stuff. And I'm like, nah, it's interesting. I find it interesting. Obviously, it's really going to depend on which industry you're in, which company you're in terms of the challenges you're going to solve. Because obviously, if we were all at Red, or if I pronounce that correctly, Red Associates, it's going to be very different. That's more of your trad anthropological work. It's pretty cool stuff, basically, right? Edward Jones, I'm in enterprise UX. So what does that mean? That means I'm more I work with internal tools and systems to make them more efficient. So we're all thinking about how to make it more efficient, for the branch teams that I work with. So I support 3 product teams at the moment, different tools, trying to solve different challenges. Sometimes they can get incredibly minute, but it's under the umbrella of just efficiency. I mean, being in financial services, I think we have a little bit more time because we're internal, right? We're not client facing. It's not as fast. So I like that. I can be grateful. There's a little bit more time allowed for me to think a little bit. Obviously, I'm not, writing I don't know, articles to my product owners. I still have to answer certain questions, but at least in my reports, I like to embroider it with some other insights, as it relates to the larger context. And a lot of it has to do with the enterprise systems, right? I kind of alluded to earlier about it is a system. And a lot of these systems were like built at different points in time, and the way they communicate with each other, it's kind of like haphazard. So I mean, there are some tools like from the 1980s, like think Wolf of Wall Street, that are still like present. I don't work with them, but I've seen them. They're pretty like retro, super cool. But the tools I'm working with like right now, obviously much more like modern, but the way they interact with other tools, it's all very complicated sometimes. When the real answer would be like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't be designing systems that like don't take, I don't know, the entire Edward Jones ecosystem into account. I don't know, just a thought. I mean, it's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult. Like, it's not going to be easy. Like you'll have days we're going to be like super frustrated. But and they should know this ahead of time, so they know how to prepare for that sort of like mentally. Like it's not all like every day you're going to be out in the field collecting data. There'll be days, maybe even weeks of like nothing really happening. You're really like annoyed with yourself, and you're like, damn, am I a failure? I mean, I think it's important, like they should know this. Like, there's going to be a lot of like, negative affects floating around. You just have to deal with it. And trying to get I don't know, in contact with your advisor, and your advisor just like puts you on read. I don't know. But yeah, it's a kind of a like, maybe in some instances anyway, like a known unknown. Like there's going to be circumstances that are going to come about, but you don't know if and when they're going to happen. And if you're kind of like equipped to deal with them, like from I would say an emotional like perspective, like they don't really talk about that. Don't do a boot camp. It's not worth like the time. I would say with training at the MA, especially PhD level, like you have all that it takes. Of course, it's translating those skill sets in a way that like private industry recruiters will understand. Having said that, obviously they're like, oh, but was it paid work? And it's just like, I mean, it was. I mean, you were paid by the university. So sometimes I suppose it could be a matter of like presentation, like as well. But it's just like, and like obviously learning some industry jargon. There's a lot of overlap with some of these terms. Obviously, how they use it and the meanings will shift, are slightly different, but like, yeah, like just be confident. And I feel like there's a profound lack of lack of confidence among a lot of people, like shifting from like academia to the private industry. And a lot of it has to do with like being in academia, which I believe is like a confidence grinding machine in so many ways. It's like, oh, you didn't publish in a top journal, like, get out of here. Oh, you didn't get like tenure track, again, like, get out of here. And it's over. I mean, this already. It's interesting how like academia is the only like space where like the more experience you have, I don't know, as a visiting professor or like postdoc, is actually counted against you. Expensive too. Like if you can take maybe a short course, like, just like 1 month, kind of like pick up some of the jargon, some of the lingo, that's okay. But not like a 10K or whatever, like boot camp for like 3, 6, 1 year. You don't need that. Like you have all the skills already. It's like, I'm not kind of like an American kid growing up in this household, like, why are we eating this? This is odd. Or, explaining in front of like my white like classmates when I was like a kid, like, oh, this is totally normal thing to eat. I don't know, it'd be like some like Lebanese dish, I don't know, my dad made. After a while, it kind of gets annoying. I mean, sometimes you're like, oh, I'm kind of special. Other times it's like, like, can we get past this?
Like what you see? Let us know. Find us at practicinganthropology.org, LinkedIn, Meta, X, Bluesky, and YouTube. sNAPAshots.